you be okay with doing a short introduction?
Yeah, and I'm looking at you, right?
Yes.
All right, so, sorry, I get a little nervous. All right, I'm Alexandra Bracken. I'm the author of the New York Times bestselling In the Darkest Mind series, also a Star Wars retelling of A New Hope, The Princess, the Scoundrel, and the Farm Boy, and now Passenger, which is a time travel, adventure, romance, romp. It's a little bit of everything. It's really fun.
So first off, can you give us a brief summary of Passenger?
Oh my gosh, a brief summary of Passenger. This book defies brief summaries. It's really, I pitched it to my editor as being sort of like a treasure hunt that spans centuries and continents. So it's sort of a treasure hunt through time, in that a modern day New Yorker, her name is Etta, who's sort of like a violin prodigy, suddenly finds herself caught in this search. She discovers that she has the ability to travel back in time through these time passages that connect centuries and locations. And she is kind of drawn into this dangerous hunt for this missing artifact, and it's like tied to her family's history that she hasn't known about at that point. And if she can find it, she can return home. If not, she will be in serious peril.
So did you have the time travel system completely worked out before you started writing, or did you have to adjust it along the way to fix any time paradoxes that you came across as you were going about it?
Interestingly enough, when it comes to figuring out the time travel system, in terms of whether or not I had it figured out in advance, I thought I had it figured out in advance, and then as I was writing was like, wow, I've created another paradox, and another paradox, and another paradox. So you kind of sometimes write yourself into a corner, and then you get caught in the trap of having to explain why this is not a paradox. But it's really interesting, and it's very like brain-bendy to think about how all of like one small act in a previous century can ripple out into the future centuries, and how everything is so interconnected with one another. So yeah, I wish I had gotten it down pat from the beginning, but by the end of it I had sort of what I called like the time traveler's guide to not dying in an awful way in a different century kind of thing. So now it's all figured out, thankfully.
How did you go about laying the path between which time periods and which locations, hitting certain historical events, and which ones connected to each other through the passages?
So when it came to actually laying out the path Etta and her traveling companion Nicholas were going to take throughout the different centuries, the connecting factor is all of these historical locations are somehow special and kind of precious to Etta's family. And it's a family she hasn't known and hasn't been exposed to. She did not know she was a time traveler, and that this humongous secret is being kept from her. But I started off by just picking places that were interesting to me. I studied early American history in college, specifically like Revolutionary America, so I knew I wanted to write a good chunk of the book set in that time, and I knew I wanted Nicholas to be from that time, because I felt very comfortable, for whatever reason. Maybe I was bored, I had like a past life in the 18th century. I feel like very comfortable writing and reading about it. And then from there, I'm really trying to get like a good diversity in terms of where they're going. I didn't want it to be so Eurocentric. I want them to try to, I don't know if I'm going to actually accomplish this. I'm like hoping I can do it. I want them to hit like every single continent by the end of the second book. So I looked at it through that lens too, and just places I was really interested and curious about, and doing that kind of research, which ended up being like pretty heavy lifting when it came to the research.
Speaking of research, there's actually a lot of specific details involving classical music, violins, the layout of ships. How much research did you have to do for all of that?
Oh my gosh, how much research did I have to do? I had to do a lot of research, and it was interesting because it really was, I came into the story with like a fair amount of knowledge of the 18th century. Like I said, I felt like weirdly comfortable writing about that, but I wanted to go back and fact check against all of these like primary sources I had read when I was in college, and just make sure I had it down right and I wasn't doing it at a service. But I ran into some trouble in the, I don't want to spoil the locations, but like in certain locations where the primary language is in English, it became harder to like search for the primary documents, especially if they hadn't been translated. But I did research from the violin. I am not a musician. I am like a tragic case of like last year at clarinet, the 3 years I attempted to play it, was always really bad. So researching the violin, musical theory, I did a lot of research on sort of the violin prodigy types and what their lives were like in that competition circuit. And then I did a lot of like privateer research, which ended up being really cool and really interesting. But the hardest aspect of this book to research was finding the layout of what the ship would look like inside, because for some reason, I don't think in the 18th century they kept really good records and like what we would call like a blueprint now of anything but the military warships, because those were commissioned and had to go through, I think, a bunch of approvals before they could be made, whereas sort of like a merchantman ship or just like a smaller privately owned ship didn't necessarily have plans made. So I watched a lot of films, read a lot of different books. The Master and Commander series was really interesting to read and kind of figure out and kind of like absorb enough information to be able to make a good guess about what the ship would look like. Yeah, and not even just that, but also like Nicholas is primarily from the 18th century, even though he's a time traveler, so looking at which words Etta uses as a 21st century person, that he would understand phrases that would make sense to him, or he could like figure out, so like, or even just use. So that ended up being like actually probably the most research intensive, like going to consult the Oxford English Dictionary to make sure he like would actually have used this word or this phrase in the 18th century.
Yeah, it's also kind of the opposite, where there was an instance where Etta was on the ship and then they used the word marry in terms of nodding, and she was like, what?
Yeah, it's so like a lot of the words we use today have been in use forever, but their meanings have just changed, especially from the 18th century. They get corrupted or they become kind of slang, and so the meaning changes for everyone. And so I love like those instances where she like makes a connection to something that she knows, or he is like able to sort of glean what she means, or even when she says hi to someone, that's not something that they said in the 18th century, so they're like, hi, like what's hi, that kind of thing. It was really fun. I love fish out of water scenarios, so this is time travel is the ultimate fish out of water scenario.
Also, I used to play music as well. I played the flute for 8 years, so I was just wondering, why G major?
Why G major? That's a good question. Honestly, it was because I researched, okay, so passages resonate to the G major scale. So that I needed some way that Etta's music would kind of like prompt the passage to respond back and kind of interrupt her performance. And I think the G major scale is pretty commonly used in music. Would you agree with that?
It's been a while.
Yeah, I think that's the reason why I picked it, and it was in the piece that I wanted her to be playing, so that kind of, like, I was like, well, I guess it's G major. I wish I had a better answer for that, but it really was like what the story called for, and like how I could then implement it throughout and kind of like weave it into the story and explain why Etta hadn't heard it before and why she heard it in that moment. Kind of thing.
So did you choose that piece of music beforehand, and then?
Yeah, I really wanted her to be playing that specific piece of music. So yeah, it's like anytime a musician or a violinist on Twitter or on Instagram says they're like reading the book, I'm like, oh my god, I hope I did okay, because that was really such a foreign world for me. I guess I just like didn't grasp enough of the musical theory that I was supposed to be picking up in middle school to play the clarinet, which probably explains why I was so tragically bad at it. But yeah, I thought that was actually some of the most interesting research I did, and learning about like the famous violin makers and how they have such like an incredible reputation. The instruments are described as being almost living, breathing like creatures with personalities in terms of how the music comes out of them. Yeah, I thought it was cool. Yeah, but G major was just kind of like, what scale is in this one piece of music that I want her to be playing at the beginning of the book?
This is really specific.
I know.
It's really cool.
It had to be specific, yeah.
So shifting over to the characters, are there any characteristics that you keep in mind when you're developing your protagonists?
When I'm developing protagonists, really, I almost never start a book unless I have a good grip on who they are as people. And at least have a good sense of what I want their defining characteristic to be, even though people and characters aren't just like one thing. But I knew with Etta that I really wanted her ambition to shine through, and I wanted her to be very determined and someone who's commits herself to things wholeheartedly and is able to, being a New Yorker, is able to kind of like reassess and quickly like make a decision and like is flexible, which I think is a good quality to have when you're a time traveler. You have to be able to like take that hit and recover and like figure out and adapt quickly. And then with Nicholas, I knew I also wanted his ambition to match hers, and that's something that they really connect with initially. So with Etta, with any character who's the main character, even with Nicholas, I have to have a very good sense of like what their voice sounds like, their pattern of speech, they have accents. So like Nicholas's chapters in this book are meant to feel a little bit older because the narrative voice is like a close third person for someone from the 18th century, so it's like a little bit more verbose, like a little bit like more archaic than Etta's chapters are. So that was also really fun to kind of like write those two different mentalities and show how they're alike and how they're different.
Was it intentional from the very beginning for the main characters to be a woman and a man of color, given social hardships that they were definitely going to face in certain time periods?
So in the very early drafts of this book, like when I was still really outlining it, Nicholas wasn't African American, and for some reason I was like, this isn't what I want to tell. I want to like show that time travel is actually like gonna be inevitably very difficult and different for someone who is not a white man. And so it became like very important for me again once I was like, well, they're not just going to be traveling back to one period and it's not going to be like American or Eurocentric. I really wanted to show like a diversity of experiences, and I wanted to show how their situation and their feeling of safety changes with each period that they're in. Like they feel safer in certain periods than they do in other periods, and they kind of have to adapt in ways that they struggle with. Like Etta doesn't like in the 18th century that she's there primarily as decoration and kind of is supposed to not voice her opinions, be seen, not heard. And I think it's just more interesting. I think that's something that I really wanted this book to feel as inclusive as possible. And I thought it ended up being a much more interesting read to have those tiny and big struggles shown.
There are so many elements happening at once. You have time travel, the treasure hunt, the secret family, the forbidden romance. Were there certain story threads that you prioritized more than others in order to find that balance?
So when it came to prioritizing all of the like thousands of different things that seemed to be imploding at once, I think the consistent thing for me, I really wanted the character arcs to be foremost, and I wanted it to have sort of a sense of adventure, and I didn't want the time travel mechanics to really overwhelm the story, but there is like a good deal of setup that has to go into place to explain why something isn't a paradox and how the system works, otherwise it's very confusing. So I really just tried to center the story on Nicholas and Etta as humans. Like I wanted it to feel like a very human story, and then woven like the romance, woven the adventure, and hopefully did an okay job of balancing all these aspects so one isn't overwhelming any of the others or shadowing the others. That was a good question. I was like, oh, I haven't thought about it that way. But yeah, that's a tough thing. That was the hardest part of the book, was balancing all of that and juggling it and making sure it made sense.
What do you do when you face writer's block? Are there certain what's basically your favorite part to write, and what passages do you hate, like whether it be dialogue or descriptions or etc. backstory?
So everyone hates writer's block. I hate writer's block because usually writer's block for me is that I'm bored with the story. I either know too much of what's happening, or it just doesn't feel exciting to me, or I know subconsciously or consciously that there's a problem with the story and I don't know how to fix it, and so I try like writing around it, but I know, as they say in Passenger, the only way out is through. Like I have to figure out how to fix that problem. And I hate, when I'm drafting, I hate stopping to reassess, and I like the forward momentum and the energy that comes with like getting the chapters out, getting the scenes out. And so like to have to stop and like force myself to take a breath and figure out how to fix things going forward, I think that's the most important part. And I also think it's okay to actually take a break. But my one trick is that when I feel really stuck or I'm feeling anxious about writing, which is also another reason I get writer's block, if I feel very overwhelmed with how much I have to write, or like with the Star Wars book, for example, I felt so nervous about writing it. I switched and I wrote by hand. I wrote the entire Star Wars book by hand and transferred it to the computer because it somehow felt like less pressure. So I always suggest trying to like switch your writing instruments, I guess, to see if that helps kind of like trigger something in your brain that helps you like flip a switch kind of thing. But my favorite part of writing, that's a good question. When I first started out, it was really writing the first draft, and like I love the energy of it. I love like knowing how the book is going to end and like building and building and building towards it. And I think now that I have a couple books under my belt, I actually appreciate the revision process so much more than I used to, because books are made in the revision process more so than the drafting process. So I've started calling my first drafts like draft 0, because I know that I'm going to be doing a lot of heavy lifting with them, and that's okay. I have to like get rid of the perfectionist voice in my head of being like, I have to nail it on the first try. You do not have to nail a story on the first try. You just have to get there and work with your editor, work with critique partners, and like really sharpen and hone the story. So now I have a very great appreciation for the revision process and how like enormous and crucial it is to actually finishing a book.
I love this cover. Did you have any kind of input with the design, or what was the cover process with Passenger?
Oh my gosh, you know what's so interesting is that my editor had this idea for the cover from the beginning. Like, she had a very strong vision of what she wanted the cover to look like, and she sent me what we call a cover comp, which is sort of like a rough, it's not like an app. It's not a rough sketch usually. Sometimes it's a sketch if it's an illustrated cover, but it kind of shows the placement using stock images of what they'll later refine to show you the general kind of concept. And so we kind of like worked off of that, but the cover really has not changed from the beginning. We kind of tweaked it a little bit. We lightened certain things. We took out like a small element to make it like a little, to like make sure that it wasn't, that element wasn't detracting from the clear line of the skyline. That was a way to explain that. But I love it. I think it's absolutely beautiful, and I love the, like, if you look a little closer, there's a ship being reflected in the bottle, and I like that it's such a clever play on the idea of a ship in the bottle, and that it gives you a sense of the adventure, but also kind of makes you curious about it, because you're like, why is the Manhattan skyline in a bottle? Like, what's happening? But yeah, and the hand lettering I think is beautiful on the title. I finally looked up the artist who did it on Twitter, and I've been like quietly creeping on all of her work now. She's so great. But yeah, I've been so happy that people are responding to the cover and really like it. And we're working on the book 2 cover right now, trying to make it equally as great. I think it's going to be really cool.
Speaking of Wayfarer, is there anything you can say about it?
What can I say about Wayfarer? Well, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this without spoiling the ending of Passenger, but we'll say that there are 2 separate journeys that eventually merge into one journey again, and it's it also deals a little bit with alternate history, because there's like an alternate timeline situation that might happen in the Passenger. So that was really cool to write. I haven't written any alternate history yet, and it really shows like the consequences of meddling in time and trying to do what like the Ironwoods did, the big central time travel family in this, where they just kind of like manufacture the timeline that best suits their needs and their business interests, and how dangerous and awful that is. And there's also like a little bit of like a fantasy, maybe magic element that comes into play. So I'm like super excited for people to read it. I gotta finish it. I'm almost done with this draft, so I think that'll be good. I know, I'm like, what else can I tell you? Nothing else. Nothing else until it's done.
So that's all the questions I have for Passenger. If I can ask, so your novelization of Star Wars A New Hope was called The
Princess the
Scoundrel and the Farm Boy. If you were to write a novelization of The Force Awakens, what would you call it?
Oh, that's such a good... Okay, what would I call a novelization of The Force Awakens? I would be tempted to call it, Ray, you're my girl, Ray. I just loved her so much. I don't know. You know what? When The Force Awakens, the title was announced, I think everyone was sort of like, okay, but that's such a perfect title for it. And I feel like that captures like the essence of it and the energy of like the new beginning. I don't know. It would probably be, I'm so bad with titles, I have to tell you. Like, Passenger is probably my only book that has had the title that I like gave it originally. And so we actually we didn't struggle with figuring out the title for this, but with the Star Wars book, but it did take us a while to kind of land on something that we all liked. So I don't know, I'm so bad. I would probably be like, A New Beginning, or something really corny like that. I know. You're my girl, Ray. love you. And then in parentheses, I love you too, Benno.
Also, lastly, I read that you have an addiction to Mountain Dew. How is that going?
You know, he also has an addiction to Mountain Dew.
Oh no.
It's a shared thing.
Oh no.
I have this really, it's not even a secret shame anymore, but it's like, I have this addiction to Mountain Dew. It's like my go-go juice. Isn't that what Honey Boo Boo called it? Her go-go juice? Basically, she would add more sugar to the Mountain Dew, and that was her go-go juice, and somehow she survived this. I'm like, the amount of Mountain Dew I drink is like almost shocking. I'm surprised my organs have not like liquefied at this point, but it's so, for some reason, it's like, I think I've like conditioned my brain to need it when I'm writing, especially when I'm like on deadline, I have to get words out. It's like the right, perfect amount of caffeine and sugar to like trigger like frantic typing and like banging out scenes and all of that. But yeah, it's going better. I finally this past year learned to like coffee, which is like a good, slightly healthier form of caffeine, maybe. What I really need to do is like cut back my sugar addiction. I think that's not helping. But yeah, I'm working on it. It's always a work in process. Love you, man.
Very much.
That's all I've got. Thank
Cool,
you.
thank you guys. I hope that was okay.